Hey, welcome back to my channel. So, last week I did a little run through of some of my favorite Beatles books, and that got me to thinking, what about the Beatles albums? Because after all, that is what they're primarily known for, their music, their great music. Well, some of it's great, some of it's and then there's Come Together, which, as I said in my previous video, probably not my favorite Beatles song. But anyway, so today I'm going to take a little side track from talking about books to talk about music. Now, I am not going to play in the music from the Beatles because one, they're very litigious, and two, I just would rather just talk than play in the music. And so there you go. Uh, Before I rank the albums, and I want to issue a few caveats. First off, technically they released 13 studio albums during their time together, but I only briefly had a copy of the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. It's okay, but I don't have a copy of it anymore. And I don't really think about it in terms of the Beatles albums. So if there are people out there who are like going to watch this and be offended that I don't have the Yellow Submarine soundtrack on this list, I apologize. Secondly, a lot of the Beatles' most famous songs actually did not appear on their albums because, or at least in the UK originally, because the Beatles were very much releasing singles and then albums. Very rarely did they try to actively put like the singles on the albums because they believe very much in like giving the public something new with each recording, be it a album or something shorter like an EP or a single. So a lot of the best songs are actually either, if you were in America from the years 1964 to 1967, they were thrown together on like really cheap compilations made of Beatles albums, tracks, and singles and B sides. But the actual singles I have on these two very nice collection or very nice CDs: the Beatles Past Masters Volume One, Volume Two, and these are fun to listen to because again they have all the singles that the Beatles released in the UK. So they're actually based on the British charts, not the American charts. And also, they have some really interesting stuff. Like they have the hits, obviously, like "She Loves You" and "I Want to Hold Your Hand," to like "Hey Jude" and "Revolution." But they also have German language versions of "I Want to Hold Your Hand," or is it "Komm, gib mir dein Hand," and "She Loves You" or "Sie liebt dich." And then on the second volume, it ends with the B side to Let It Be, which is called "You Know My Name, Look Up the Number," which is probably, no joke, one of my favorite Beatles songs that I didn't know existed until I bought this CD, like in my teens, maybe, or early 20s. Like, it's so strange and bizarre and out there that it really feels more like Monty Python than the Beatles, but I digress. Let's get on to the album rankings, and these are my own personal preferences. So if you think that I'm wrong or ill informed or whatever, first off, I'm not ill informed. I read so many books about the Beatles over my long life. So I can't possibly be ill informed. So, you know. But, again, these are my opinions, and this is what I believe. And I will say, I think my rankings are based more on albums that I return to more often than not, necessarily. Like, there's something good about each of the 12 albums I have. Again, I did not possess a copy of Yellow Submarine, the album, for long enough to really form an opinion either way. But of the albums that I have, even the albums at the very bottom have something good to them, but they're just at the bottom because either I don't listen to them that much or I just don't really like them that much overall. So we're going to start with kind of a hot take, but Yeah, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Freudian slip, is honestly my least favorite Beatles album. And that is for a very good reason. One is, well, a few good reasons. One is it is the most famous Beatles album, and that's primarily because, the iconography of, I don't know if you can really see some of the glare from my from the windows might kind of obscure it. It's probably a good idea not to hold it up right to the camera for videos and things like that because it's reflecting back my screen as I record this. But anyway, uh, it's a famous album cover, but I think a lot of people who praise it never have actually sat down and listened to the entire thing. I have on numerous occasions, and I think the first few times I listened to an old cassette tape when I was much younger, and it's an album that its reputation precedes it, but then the actual album itself doesn't really live up to the reputation, if that makes sense. Like, there are some good songs on here. I don't want to take away from that. I think uh, I'm one of the few people that actually likes the song When I'm 64 by Paul McCartney. It's Paul being just cheesy, at his most cheesy Paul McCartney esque, but I kind of like it. The title track and reprise are very good. Uh, I really like "She's Leaving Home." That's a beautiful kind of sadder song on some of this stuff. And then what the Beatles are known for. Good Morning" is kind of fun. "Lovely Rita's" okay. "A Day in the Life" is, I would say, probably the only real classic song on here. Classic Beatles song. But that's really about it. And probably the most famous song on here is famous because it was covered by Joe Cocker live at Woodstock in 1969. And that is "With a Little Help from My Friends." I will say this: on the album, as sung by Ringo, "With a Little Help from My Friends" is like really kind of funny, and you can tell like John and Paul specifically wrote it for Ringo to sing, and it's kind of weird and funny and this strange creation. Joe Cocker is like, in his live 1969 Woodstock version, is like just beats it to death with like sincerity. And there are some songs that work better as playful. And "With a Little Help from My Friends," I would argue works better as a playful kind of, cheeky wordplay by Lennon and McCartney. Joe Cocker just like, eh, it's its own thing. It's not ruined per se, but it's like, eh. So, Sergeant Pepper, my lowest ranked album. Next up, Beatles for Sale. This came out in December 1964, and if you know anything about the Beatles' history, 1964 is like the big year for them because obviously they conquered America. They went on huge world tours. They made the film A Hard Day's Night, the album of which is coming up much later in the rankings. So by the time it came time for them to record Beatles for Sale in October and November of 1964, they were exhausted. They were beat out completely. And they could have used that as an excuse to like just mail it in. And not every song here is great, obviously, because they do to a certain extent kind of rely on covers to fill out the runtime because the storehouse of Lennon McCartney tunes ready to go was pretty much exhausted at that point. There are some good originals on here. No Reply, I'm a Loser, Babies in Black. My personal favorite is I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, which is like, it's like uh, gothic rockabilly, gothabilly, if you will, because it's like this the singer like lamenting that he's like really sad and stuff, but the music is jaunty and fun. The covers kind of range in quality, like rock and roll music. A Chuck Berry cover, like that's pretty good, but the Kansas City medley, I usually skip that. Words of Love, I skip that. Honey Don't, I don't really care for that one. Every Little Thing is original, but Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, which is I think that's one of George's first turns at bat as doing a song, doing lead on an album, lead vocal, and it's okay, but you can tell that they're really really worn out by the time they recorded uh, Beatles for Sale in 1964, and just looking at the album cover is like, oh, we're so we're so sad, we're depressed. It's like The Cure minus the makeup or whatever. 20 years prior, whatever. Next up, one of the first soundtrack albums that will be on this list, and it's probably the lowest rated or lowest ranked, but it is Beatles' Help. Now, I'll say this. I actually think that the soundtrack album is better than the movie, which is not necessarily a controversial take in Beatles fandom because the movie Help is playfully pre or proto Monty Python sort of surrealism, but it doesn't quite work. And I say this as someone who's only really seen the film all the way through once in my life, but you know, it's very much a product of its time in a lot of ways, and that's not necessarily a compliment. It doesn't quite work as a film, I think. It's something to do with like Ringo putting on this like sacred ring that belongs to a blood drinking cult that wants to get the ring back, and they're going to all these links to get it back, and hijinks ensue in Maud London of 1965. It doesn't work. It really doesn't. But what does work is that the album Help has Help, which is, the title of the movie. It's John Lennon's cry for help at the time because he was very much trapped in the uh, overwhelmingness of fame, which, no one, like, at least he had the other three Beatles to be with him. Elvis Presley, and was by himself for the most part, as far as being like thrust into this worldwide stardom out of nowhere. Uh, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away is a great song. I also like You're Gonna Lose That Girl. That's probably the best song that is in the movie, honestly. This one actually, Ticket to Ride. That's a great one, obviously. But what drags it down in a lot of ways is the side with songs that are not in the movie because they really feel like sort of leftovers. Like It's Only Love is like not good, not at all. You Like Me Too Much by George Harrison is like him trying to ape the Lennon McCartney style, just not quite doing it very well. But there are two songs on what would have been side two in a vinyl release, but are all include tracks 12 and 13. In this case, I've Just Seen a Face, which is a Paul song mostly, where it's just a lot of fun, sort of country influenced, sort of yearning and weird, choices in terms of like the rhythm and tone of it and all, but it works really well for me. I love it to death. And of course, the most famous song of Paul's Beatles career, probably, and probably the one that's going to be like on his tombstone when he passes away, which is Yesterday. The song Yesterday. Sorry, didn't want to. Yeah, when you say Yesterday, and it's like, oh wait, he passed away yesterday. No, 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 no. The song Yesterday. It's really, that's one of those songs that for a long time, because I guess I'm a contrarian at heart, whenever people said, oh, that's the best song that Paul ever wrote, I'm like, no, it's not. And I really do believe that. in all honesty. I don't believe it's his best song that he wrote, either with the Beatles or solo, but it resonates in a lot of ways. And the story of it, how he woke up one day with the melody in his head and he couldn't think of the words. So for the time being, like he wrote scrambled eggs, like just to feel it till he could come up with like actual lyrics that meant something. And it's really about his mom. His mom passed away when Paul was 14, and she was the primary source of income for their family. So in a moment that I think he looks back on with a lot of regret because of the way it came out, but in a way that like kids oftentimes speak the truth without necessarily meaning to. He said, what do we do without her money? And, that's the last thing, his dad probably wanted to hear at the time because of the grief, but it's really kind of, it's one of those moments in time where, and we all have times like that where we say something or we think something and we're like, I really regret that. But he got like a really good song out of it. And for the record, the movie yesterday where a guy wakes up and he's the only one that remembers the Beatles, I've seen people on YouTube say that they don't like the movie, and that's fine. I kind of liked it. I just did. So moving on to number nine. Number nine. This is "Let It Be." Now, in recent years, with Peter Jackson version or the Peter Jackson film Get Back, which is an expansion on what Let It Be was, which is a film documenting the Beatles' last days, or supposed to be their return to rocking, doing more like live rock and roll performances and stuff like that. Like, there's been a sort of reappraisal of the whole Let It Be period, which, you know, honestly, that was not the end of the Beatles. Like, all the stuff from Let It Be was recorded in January 1969. The Beatles still had about a year and a couple more months left to go in terms of their lifespan in the chronology. But we look at it, those of us who are Beatles fans look at it as sort of the last real moment that they had together, even though we know better. Like, there was, of course, Abbey Road to come later, and then this would be, excuse me, this would be released sort of under difficult circumstances, in no small part because Phil Spector, in probably the worst thing he did music wise, because those of you who know a little bit about Phil Spector probably know that he did a lot worse in regular life, in his personal life, in criminal court of law. But a musical crime that he committed was this album, the production of it, because on one particular song, especially "The Long and Winding Road," is one of Paul's best ballads. And it's sort of in the same vein as Yesterday, where you kind of think it might be more about his mom than any sort of romantic situation. But he's pouring his heart and soul into this. Phil Spector goes in the re-recording process and adds like a heavenly choir and syrupy strings and things like this. And like, even when I was younger and first listening to the Beatles, I was like, this is a great song that does not need all this crap around it. The Spectre sound, as it were, the wall of sound, didn't need any of that. But it's still a great song. So Let It Be was going to be their return to sort of making live performances and things like that, because from 1966 onwards, the 1966 World Tour, where John had said, we're bigger than Jesus, and that was taken way out of context in the American South, and a lot of threats were made against them. And really, just after 3 years or more of touring around the world, they were just worn out completely. So they retreated to the studio to make Sgt. Pepper and other things. And so Let It Be, or Get Back, was supposed to be a return to live performances. Did not work out that way. But we do have this. I rank it pretty high. I like it pretty well. Uh, I feel like I like it better than a lot of Beatles fans do. The discourse around it, I think, certainly has changed since the Peter Jackson film came out. I haven't seen the Peter Jackson film. I would like to, but I haven't. And this one has probably a, I would say, if not for the fact that it's on like the very last Beatles album, I think that the song "I've Got a Feeling" would be a stone cold Beatles classic. It's great, sort of John and Paul interplay where they're just kind of shouting these lyrics at each other. Or, well, Paul's like going at it kind of in his sort of Little Richard style, not like Little Richard, but sort of being very demonstrative in his vocals, and John's just like, everybody had a good kind of just laid back and stuff, and it's a beautiful song. I love it to death. Let It Be, the title song, is another one, definitely about his mom and her passing when he was a young man. It's a classic. It's lovely. It's beautiful. It's one of the ones that doesn't quite get ruined by the Phil Spector treatment. Get Back, the title, well, was going to be the title song, but it ended up being, it was probably, I think it was, in fact, the last, or one of the last singles that the Beatles released in America, certainly, anyway. And let's see, Dig a Pony is really good. That's one of John's later songs that's kind of about Yoko, but is also about like his heroin addiction and things like his horse heroin, sort of thing. Across the Universe is a lovely song. George gets pretty good show on For You Blue, which is an album track that I think really could have been a single if the Beatles had been like, even at that stage, being like, no, no, George, no, you can't have a single. It's got to be either John or Paul. Sorry. So, yeah. But yes, I have Let It Be at number 9. So there you go. Coming up at number 8 is the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me. This one is a legendary recording because it was put together from, this is one of the few Beatles albums that has the singles that came beforehand to fill it out, really. The singles being Love Me Do and Please Please Me. And, that's great. Don't get me wrong. But this is one of the ones that early on, the album tracks that they wrote themselves are up there with what was in the zeitgeist at the time. In this case, early 1963. It starts with probably, I think Rob Sheffield in his book Dreaming the Beatles said like this is like the best opening song on a debut album ever, and I cannot really dispute his argument, which is the song I Saw Her Standing There. Now, of course, it has the line, she was just 17, you know what I mean? Which, I mean, you could argue that Paul was 20 at the time he wrote that, so maybe it's not quite as creepy as it could be, I'm just throwing that out there, but, it's got some covers on it, some pretty decent covers, like, I don't know. I think Misery's pretty good. I think it's kind of a funnily like not even Beatles, not even trying to be miserable as they sing it. They're kind of vamping it up. Anna, Go to Him is a classic. Well, actually, it's not a classic, but it's a really good rendition by the Beatles in this one. Do You Want to Know a Secret is a Lennon McCartney original that George sings, his first lead vocal on a Beatles album, and you can tell he is nervous as all get out about doing that, but it still works. But really, like the standout song on this is the very last one, the dare I say iconic cover of Twist and Shout that closes the record. And this is really where like the legend of the Beatles, in a sense for me, really begins, where John and the rest of the band know they have to nail this on the first try because they have been recording this album over the course of a day, over the course of a few hours at, I think, EMI Studios in London. And they have to nail this on the first take because John's throat will go. His voice will go out if they don't nail it on this first take. And I cannot think of. I don't want to say it's the best cover version of any song ever, but it has to be in the discussion. And just knowing the circumstances that it took for them to record it after doing the rest of the album over the course of the day and knowing they cannot mess this up. It's got to be done in this one take, and that's it. Because John's voice will not sustain it. Because they had to go right back out on the road. How in the world they were going to go back on the road with John possibly shredding his vocal cords, I have no idea. But that's the way it was in 1963 when you were involved in show business, I guess. But yes, Please Please Me ends on, yeah, fine, I'll say it. The best cover in the history of recorded music. Speaking of covers and cover art, haha, we have at number 7 With the Beatles. This is released. This is one of the ones that Capitol Records in the United States kind of fudged the track listing of and added singles to and turned it into Meet the Beatles in time for I think it was January 1964 release because obviously in the immediate aftermath of John F. Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963, which is also when this album dropped in the UK, America needed something to take its mind off the pain of losing a president to assassination. And the Beatles charted in the United States for the first time in January with I Want to Hold Your Hand. And so all of a sudden, after about a year of just ignoring the Beatles and their impact in Britain, Capitol Records in America finally had to sit up and be like, oh, wait a minute. This band from Liverpool, England, they might have something. And turned out that, of course, they did. And this is, excuse me, a very iconic album cover. It might be, I would say, if not for Abbey Road or Sgt. Pepper, this would be like the most iconic album cover. I even had a t-shirt with this on the front, and then like on the back it said, Meet the Beatles, whatever. Just from years of wearing it and doing laundry and stuff, I have since lost the shirt. Unfortunately, it fell apart. But if I were to go online on Amazon and want to buy a Beatles t-shirt, I'd probably want to get one with this image on it, just for the heck of it. This one is, Please Please Me was the debut. It was recorded in one day. And as Eric Idle says in the Ruddles documentary, the Ruddles being like a parody of the Beatles that aired in 1978, the Ruddles, their first album was recorded in 20 minutes. The second album took even longer. That's the case with the Beatles. It took even longer to record. And as I said, it was put out on November 22nd, 1963, which is an odd sort of kinetic moment in world history because as you have this album, which is filled with hopeful, optimistic songs about love and romance and things like this, this horrific event takes place in Dallas, Texas, a world away. And by the way, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Sorry. I've done the research. I love the novel Lieber by Don DeLillo, but Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Anyway, this one starts strong with the opening track, It Won't Be Long. I think that's, of the early Beatles stuff, when I was getting into the Beatles, this was like one of my favorite tracks. And it still is. It remains one of my favorites. There's, the Paul McCartney of, All I've Got to Do, All My Loving is kind of I would say probably the classic song from the album. But there's also some really good covers on here. Please Mr. Postman is a nice little 3-part showcase for John Paul George with John singing the lead. Roll Over Beethoven. I think that was a George lead vocal on that one. Hold Me Tight, a Beatles original, a Lennon McCartney original that is quite good. And I don't know why it was never released as a single, other than the fact that I think the group themselves kind of hated the song. They didn't really like it that much. I think it's used to really good effect in the film Across the Universe, which is another Beatles related film that kind of has its detractors and haters, but I enjoyed it when I saw it. Uh, Great, amazing cover of "You've Really Got a Hold on Me" by where John is singing the lead, which is a Smokey Robinson original. And Smokey Robinson, it just got started in his recording career whenever the Beatles came on the scene. Like, I think Smokey was one of the first Motown artists, if not the first, to release an album, or release a song in 1959 or 1960. So just getting started, and here are the Beatles covering him. And I don't want to say did it better because the original is really good, but it's up there. Uh, Money, another the song Money, not the one by Pink Floyd, but the original Motown version covered here by the Beatles. It's a good sort of overlook at the Beatles right on the precipice of fame. And I think honestly, like, this might be like a good of the early albums where you can have songs that kind of like uh what was it on I think it was on Please Please Me, Let Me Do A Taste of Honey. That's a skippable track. I don't think I've ever listened to that one all the way through. But I don't think that With the Beatles has really anything skippable on this. It also has I Want to Be Your Man song, which the Beatles gifted to the Rolling Stones, and they didn't manage to do anything good with it. I think, not that Ringo really sells it when his version or whatever, but yeah, it is what it is. At number six, I have A Hard Day's Night. This is the only album with the distinction of being solely Lennon McCartney. Like, this is the Lennon McCartney album because George doesn't really write a song on this one, neither does Ringo. I don't even think Ringo has a lead vocal on this, which is unusual because he was usually given at least one per album. Let me look at it real quick. I kind of could have done research before I did this video, but yeah, why? Anyway, yeah, I don't think. No, no. These are all John and Paul, and I'm happy just to dance with you. I think that's the only George sung track on here, and of course, this is the soundtrack for the album, or this is the soundtrack for the film that came out in late 19 or August 1964. It was filmed in April and March of 1964. This is the film that sort of cemented the Beatles legend, and I love the movie. I know it plays fast and it's not the Beatles as they really were. However, it's quite good. It's quite fun. And the soundtrack is just beginning to end beautiful, beautiful songs. There's the title track, of course. There's Can't Buy Me Love, which is a classic. There's If I Fell, which is probably John in the early stages of his career, early stages of the Beatles, being the most vulnerable he's ever going to be on record. Maybe even when his solo compared to his solo career. Uh, and some of the stuff that is on there that didn't actually appear in the film, you can't do that. That's really good. Things We Said Today, that's a great song. Really, like, I think if it weren't for the fact that there are five other albums to get to that uh, have even better stuff than A Hard Day's Night, this might even be higher. I don't know that I'd put it number one, but I would say of the pre Pepper albums, pre Sergeant Pepper albums. This, or pre 1966 albums, I'll say that. This might be, this would certainly be number two, if not number one. But we have more albums to consider. And this video is running long, but that's okay. Next up, now, if you thought me having Sergeant Pepper at the very bottom was a hot take, wait till you see what I got at number 5. Magical Mystery Tour. Yep, that's right. I went there. I honestly think Magical Mystery Tour is more fun to listen to than Sergeant Pepper. Yeah. Go ahead and get after me in the comments, any of you that are watching this. I don't care. That being said, I will concede the film Magical Mystery Tour, made for TV in 1967, right after Brian Epstein died, which, of course, was really the beginning of the end for the Beatles. But the movie itself is a hot mess. And the songs that appear in the film, some are good, some are crap, some are right in between. I think on a good day, I can listen to Blue Jay Way and be like, okay, that's not bad. Or Flying is kind of an interesting, one of the few, if not the only Beatles instrumental released during their career. But this particular version of the album, because the actual album that came out in the UK was just the songs from the film, and it was more like an EP or than an LP. But this has got also 2 songs that did not appear on Sgt. Pepper that arguably could make it more of a favorite album for me, because I do love these 2 songs, which is Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, which Penny Lane I used to hate, but I've really kind of grown to enjoy it a lot and realize that, I kind of like McCartney when he's being silly and music hall inspired and so on and so forth. I kind of like that about him. I used to hate it. I like it now. Go figure. I got over. So what? Of the songs that appear in the film, the best, and I would say, I'm going to say it. John's best song as a Beatle, I Am the Walrus. I just love the wordplay. I love the imagery it suggests. I love, it's very much, dare I say, it's John's, it's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. Because of the imagery, the wordplay, the random nods to, literary figures like Edgar Allan Poe. And, John wrote it in response to the fact that, like, even while the Beatles were still together, like, a lot of intellectuals in the UK and America were, like, taking the Beatles way too seriously. Which, as someone who takes the Beatles way too seriously now, I'm like, that's funny, haha. Oh, and here's why this song is about the Vietnam War, or, etc. I can see the contradictions, but I just love the song. It's just a weird sort of middle finger to the intellectuals who, on one hand, are like, the Beatles are amazing and John is a great songwriter, and then they're like, but we don't want him hanging out with us, and John's like, bleep you, whatever. Strawberry Fields Forever, I think, is a beautiful, haunting song that absolutely should have been on Sgt. Pepper. My God, what were they thinking? Well, actually, I know what they were thinking, because it was released in early 1967, it and Penny Lane, because there was a demand for more Beatles product, and their record label at the time was like, we've got to have something to give the people, because the Beatles have gone so many months without releasing anything, and so they were pressured to do it, and that's why they pulled Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane off the album. At least that's the story I've heard or read. But I think I kind of go back and forth about it. But I think Sergeant Pepper would have been better if it had Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane on it. But I also understand that their removal from it and then inclusion on this makes this a much more fun album to listen to than Sergeant Pepper. So there you go. Now we're getting into the top 5, and I would say these could change depending on my mood, honestly. There are times where any of these top 5 would have been my number one, other than the one that I have at number one. In fact, the one that I have at number one would not necessarily be my number one if I wasn't kind of thinking about this in terms of making a video about the Beatles and just doing this as sort of like a, clickbait. Yeah, that's right. I got you to click on it, didn't I? Yeah, I know. I'm delusional. But number 5 for now, unless I change the rankings, is Rubber Soul. This is probably the first Beatles album that was my favorite Beatles album. And what I mean is, this is the first one where I listened to it, was like, yes, I get it now. I get why the Beatles were so important. Because a lot of times when you're getting into a band, usually start with either the greatest hits or a singles collection. I know I did. I started with a bunch of tapes that had like various songs from the Beatles' career, either singles or album tracks, just kind of jumbled all together. And then I had the Red Album on tape, which the Red Album, for those of you that don't know, is a greatest hits compilation that was put together in 1974, I believe. It and the Blue Album kind of split the Beatles' career into 1962, 1966, which is the Red Album, and then 1967 to 1970, which is the Blue Album. Both of those contain like singles and some album tracks that are quite good, and including on the Red Album, which this is kind of funny in retrospect, the song Act Naturally. And I knew that my tape player to listen to tapes was going bad because one night I was listening to the Red Album and it got to Act Naturally, which is sung by Ringo, and like all of a sudden it was like just it ate my tape, and that's when I knew that my tape player was dead. So yay. But Rubber Soul is really, it's the first grown-up Beatles album. It's the first one where they weren't just trying to put out something for the market. Like they were like, there had been steps towards it, towards more artistic statements, really, like in singles and APs and such. But this is the first real album where it's like, they're not just singing songs about love and happiness. They're singing deep, meaningful things. But then it starts off with a song like Drive My Car, which is kind of a ridiculous, funny song, but I like it. It also has 2 of the best John Lennon songs from the Beatles, though, again, I'm the Walrus is the best. Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, which is a beautiful, kind of funny if you think about send up of the whole like rock star vibe, where he's like, I'm going to go home and I'm going to go to the home of this woman that I just met who is not my wife, who is a fan of my group, and we're going to sleep together. Well, he ends up sleeping in the bathtub because the woman's like playing him for a fool, whatever. And then In My Life, which, to think about that as a song that he wrote at the age of 24, looking back on his previous life, which, if you know the life of John Lennon, you know there was a lot of trauma early on with the separation between his parents and then like being raised by his aunt instead of his mom and things like that. So it kind of makes sense in that way, but it's like so strange to think somebody at the age of 24 could write such a deeply autobiographical, deeply personal, deeply reflective, beautiful song. And it's still very beautiful. And yeah, McCartney is no slouch. You Won't See Me is pretty good. I think I'm Looking Through You is pretty good. Uh, George actually shines on If I Needed Someone. And let's see, which one was Ringo got a song here somewhere. I'd have to actually go back and listen to the album to remember, maybe. Uh, and, oh, What Goes On? I think yeah, because he actually got a credit on that one. So he sung that one. My bad. But yeah, and this one kind of is sort of reflective of the songs they were listening to. Like Bob Dylan was a huge influence at the time. So was Motown and uh, soul records and country records and things like that. So this is very much like sort of the Beatles responding to, and also the Beach Boys. Beatles responding to all that influence going on from the 60s from America and packaging it back to America. And Rubber Soul led directly to Brian Wilson writing the best Beach Boys album. And yeah, I know it's not going to be that much of a surprise for people who are familiar with the Beach Boys, even on a surface level, to hear me say that Pet Sounds is their best album, especially as I don't actually own any other Beach Boys albums, but, or no, I own Earth Surfs Up, which is pretty good, but I am a Pet Sounds ride or die person. Sorry. Next up, number 3. Talking about iconic album covers, it is Abbey Road. And of course, Abbey Road is the album that is infamous for starting with Come Together, my least liked Beatles song. Sorry. Still hate it. I have not changed my opinion. But there are some things on here that are really good, including Something by George Harrison, which is his best song as a Beatle. And it may be his best song ever. And I say that as someone who loves some of his, so like, you know, What Is Life is probably my favorite George Harrison song, solo song. But Something is my favorite George Harrison Beatles song. This also has, I don't know, I don't want to go by track because this video is already very long. But when I was thinking of this video and I was thinking of the songs on Abbey Road and why I would put it number 3 instead of number 1, other than Come Together, like the worst song on here is Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which when I was thinking about it, like the thought flashed in my head, like it's like if Ned Flanders went on a killing spree. It's that's that's probably the best way I could describe that song. Like it's just so weird, like it's so jaunty and happy, and then like Paul is singing about this guy going around like hitting people with a hammer, and you know it's like, what in the world were they smoking in 1969? And as it turns out, a lot. But they could afford it because they were the Beatles. Here Comes the Sun is a beautiful song. I love. That's another George one. I kind of like the epicness of I Want You, parentheses, She's So Heavy. This is actually the longest Beatles song, I think. Certainly the longest one on an album. And I kind of like it. It's just so weird. It's like the weirdest, heaviest that the Beatles ever got. And of course, they do that on their very last album. But there you go. The medley. Oh, wait, one more before I get to the medley. The song Because is a beautiful showcase for the harmonies of John, Paul, and George. I think it's the last one, really, where they really. And I don't know that they recorded it together, you know, because there was a lot of acrimony in the band at the time. But they certainly record. It certainly sounds as if they all went into the studio and recorded it at the same time, into the same microphone. I'm not sure. I would have to go back and look at, you know, sources on that, but it feels like it. So yeah, the medley that is on side 2. There are days when I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, like parts of it. Then there are days where I'm like, I wish these had been fully fleshed out songs. I think Polythene Pam could have been a fully fleshed out song. You Never Give Me Your Money, which is actually the start of the medley, but it's still, I mean, technically, I guess it is, but it leads into the medley. I still wish that had been kind of a standalone track. Um, she came in through the bathroom window is really funny. Like it's Paul kind of, I wouldn't say channeling John because they're like we're together all the time anyway, but kind of aping John's style of being like this weird kind of subversive look at like it has arguably my favorite line in a Beatles song, which is "And so I quit the police department and found myself a steady job," which I don't know why. I just love that line. Maybe it's the liberal in me. I don't know, but I just love that line. And of course, it ends with the end, but does it? Actually, the album ends with a very short little snippet of a song called Her Majesty. And that's another one where early on in my Beatles fandom, I was like, why do they have to end the album with this crap? And then, like, now I get it. The older I am, the more I'm like, I take the Beatles seriously, but I also think they're really funny if you give them a chance. And so, as of right now, anyway, I love the fact that their last recorded album, though not last released, ends with kind of a jokey song. And now, the question, which is going to be number one? Is it going to be Revolver or the White Album, aka the Beatles, 1968? I wonder what it's going to be. Oh, wait, I already know because I did a list. Number two is Revolver. Here's the thing. I said earlier that, like, the top five could change. Really, the top two could change depending on my mood. Because Revolver is the best album they recorded in their career that actually coheres together as one singular statement. The White Album, which you already know if you're watching, is going to be number one. It's a hot mess of an album, but there's so much on there that is just cannot be denied. So anyway, I'll get to that in a second. This video is already running long, but that's okay. So Revolver is the most singular statement of the Beatles' worldview, I think, in a lot of ways, because, you know, there is the opening track, Taxman, which is probably very pedantic if you're not a millionaire rock star in England in 1966, but it still kind of resonates in a lot of ways. Eleanor Rigby, which is just as great as Yesterday is, I would say Eleanor Rigby is better. Like it is just so like, and it hits different when you're older. It really does. Like in my teens, I was like, these people sound terrible. I don't want to like because it's about these two people who just live lives with no real meaning, and one of them dies, and the other one just kind of walks away from the grave because he officiates the ceremony, whatever. And it's like these people sound boring and depressing. They're like, you grow up to into being them. Maybe I don't know. Hopefully you don't, but if you do, it just hits different, as the kids like to say. And then Here, There, and Everywhere is one. It's the most Paul song in Christendom, if you will, in the world. But there are times when I just love to listen. Like as much as I enjoy the like sarcastic, mean John songs, like put on Hey Jude or put on Here, There, and Everywhere. And if I'm in a good mood for it or I'm in an open mood for I mean, Hey Jude is my favorite Beatles song, but I'm there for it. Yellow Submarine, which again, I don't own the actual album Yellow Submarine, but it is here. It is, I would say, Ringo's best vocal showcase. It really is. Uh, I love the song And Your Bird Can Sing. John hated it. He's entitled to his opinion, but he's wrong. I love it. It's a nice little slice of sort of middle finger to wealth and status obsessed people the world over. And, you know, it's kind of ironic that he's the one singing it when he is arguably the most famous and wealthiest person in the world in 1966. Um, got to get you into my life. Like, it sounds like a love song, but it's really about drugs. So that's kind of a unexpected thing when I first read that. But I'm like kind of thinking about it now. I was like, yeah, and it's really probably the most Motown influenced or soul influenced Beatles song of the '60s. And then it ends with, I would say, the birth of modern or popular electronic music in Tomorrow Never Knows, which, I mean, it sounds like New Order to me. It sounds like Depeche Mode. It sounds like, and I'm not a huge electronic music person or, or techno person, but I like a little bit of it every now and then. Tomorrow Never Knows will not be out of place in a club in Ibiza, honestly. It's really good. But this is the best unified statement of purpose the Beatles ever recorded. For all the hot messness of this album, I gotta go with the Beatles. 1968. And I'll do a separate video about it maybe next week, just going into a deep dive on it. Until then, keep reading and keep listening to music. Good music, or any music.